Hello, friends. I'm going to give it a few minutes since this is a special time. A few more minutes for people to join.
Should we post maybe on SIG Release channel? Not sure, am I the only one, but I waited for like 3 minutes in the burn down meeting.
Yeah, I'm right about to post. All right, so for anyone who is on the call right now, the release agenda is in the Zoom chat. Please take a moment to drop your names on here and any additional topics that you might want to speak about at the bottom of the agenda. All right, so I think we've got critical mass, and let's see, and Josh is here. Okay. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the September 4th special edition of the SIG Release meeting. This is a meeting that is recorded and available on the internet, so please be mindful of what you say. Please be sure to adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, and in general, just be nice to everyone, right? So Josh is going to kick it off with a discussion around blocking and forming jobs and criteria and general discussion. So Josh, you've got the floor.
Hey there. Okay, so we've been working for a while on cleaning up and standardizing what's in release blocking and release informing, with the eventual goal of making decisions on whether or not to release a lot more deterministic, according to what test grid is showing us. Mainly the idea that if there is any test job within SIG release blocking that is red, we don't release. We're not there yet, but part of this has been setting a set of criteria and trying to apply them for tests that are both important enough and trustworthy enough to be in blocking. As part of this, I wrote up a set of documentation on what goes in blocking and what goes in informing, and how the CI signal team should pay attention to blocking and informing. But a number of questions came up during that that are as yet unresolved.
So quick note before you continue, Josh, can we have a note taker? I'm probably going to be yapping, so if anyone is interested in taking notes and getting that prestigious honor of being on the agenda, please pop in. Thank you, Gwen.
I can do it.
Thank you, Gwen.
Give me a sec to set it up. Thanks.
Oh, Josh, you can keep going.
Okay. So the three issues that we identified, and by we I mean mostly me, Aaron, and George or Jorge. It's really anyway. Identified as missing from the existing documentation and criteria. Number one is flakiness. That is early on when coming onto the blocking criteria, we set a standard for flakiness. And flakiness means, does the test reliably succeed when it ought to succeed? Does the test job reliably pass when it ought to pass? That the criteria that we set around blocking job must not be flaky is not criteria that you can actually check by looking at any of our various boards or UIs. And so we need to actually come up with a different flakiness criterion that is supported by our infrastructure so that you can pretty much instantly see which jobs are not passing the flakiness criterion and therefore ought to be removed from blocking or fixed, depending. And the issue is linked from the notes there. The second issue is we don't currently have any kind of real process, either written or even traditional, for how new jobs would get added to blocking or informing, what the process is there. And given that this has come up in the 1.16 release with the new Windows jobs, it's actually kind of important for us to figure that out. Like, do you file a PR? If so, where do you file the PR? Does it have to come up in a meeting? What are the criteria you have to meet to get on the informing a board, etc.? And none of that currently exists as process or documentation. And with what came up in there, George actually had a proposal that would be actually substantially different than what we've kind of done ad hoc in the past. There's a lot of reasons why it's appealing, but it would require working with the SIGs. That is the idea that each SIG would actually have a set of blocking jobs on their own boards, and that the release team would then cherry pick things into the SIG release boards based on them already being marked as critical on the individual SIG boards, and meeting reliability criteria. But that would obviously require cooperation of SIGs across the project to create this on the individual SIG boards. Yeah, go ahead.
Quick question: when you say SIG boards,
test grid.
What do you mean? Like
each SIG has their own boards in test grid.
Okay, test grid boards, not project
yes,
boards.
Correct. Yeah, test grid boards.
Thanks.
Yep. So if you haven't already, please take a look over his proposal. I think there's a lot to like about it, particularly because one of the big problems that the CI Signal team has had is getting responsiveness from the SIGs. And if they effectively retain ownership of their own blocking jobs, maybe they would be a little bit more responsive when those start failing without needing to be pestered by the CI Signal team in order to pay attention.
So I think of maybe a few things that I may not articulate well.
Yeah.
So one problem that I have is I noticed that there was recently a SIG CLI job that was merged into master blocking, right? That job did not have a SIG CLI alert on it, right? Which essentially means that the release team is responsible for the maintenance of that job, which I don't think is true, right? So one thing I want to make sure we do is minimize the burden for the CI signal team. I think that that's part of the goal of this. The other is making sure that the SIG is actually responsible for the jobs that they should be responsible for. So one of the thoughts that I had was to bring if we kind of restructured the way that we had blocking and informing jobs within our test grid config, right? Informing jobs you can arbitrarily put an informing, what I was thinking is you can arbitrarily put something, as long as it's discussed with SIG release, into master informing, right? Assuming it meets some set of criteria that we have partially defined. Moving into blocking, I think it should be stricter. I think it also should be under SIG release control, right? If you have a job that you want to bring into master blocking, there should be some process for it, right? As you were mentioning, so submitting an issue template, some fancy GitHub issue template that lives in Kubernetes SIG Release for a blocking job, and allows you to see the same way we do like K-org issues, right? Seeing if you meet those criteria before submitting the issue, right? Or at least having a set of checkboxes to go through when you submit that issue, right? That way, one, it's visible by people who are looking at Kubernetes SIG Release. It can be visible to the release team. We can at least have the discussion and have an audit log of that within one place. And then from there, SIG release should go about forklifting, or that SIG can go about forklifting into a set of, say, config and test infra config jobs, Kubernetes, release blocking, or some such, right? That way it's under our owner's file, and we can control whether or not the job gets in. One of the big problems that I have right now, we also need some enforcement on the test infra side to make sure that things can't arbitrarily get onto blocking just by SIG popping the annotation on, right? So a big problem that I have right now is the annotations that are configured. It's an overall improvement on the way we configure the jobs, but it also means that by applying an annotation to the Kubernetes job config, but it also means that we then have no visibility into the way that jobs land on our boards. So I think if we had a separate section with an owner's file and a process, a GitHub template or some such, that would be a start. I think we still need to get to the point where we figure out the criteria, which is what we're talking about now, right? So what do y'all think about that?
Well, it's fine, but it doesn't explain how things get into informing in the first place.
Right, but it does solve the blocking issue.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree that that's someone on SIG release, preferably somebody on the current release team, either CI signal lead or release lead, should be required to sign off whenever anything gets added to blocking.
So I think that I would go a step even further and say that this is something between the CI signal team and the SIG overall, right? Because these jobs survive release. These jobs survive the release boundary, right? So this is something that, so like the SIG CLI thing, I think I saw at some point and then forgot about it, and then saw the PR pop up again, and I was like, oh wait, why is that? So I think having some continuity around that, and so like, yes, the release team lead can be involved, but I think the CI signal lead as well as the SIG chair should be involved as well.
Yeah. So what do you think of the suggestion of asking the SIGs to have their own blocking boards?
I don't like it. I don't hate it. I don't. So part of the reason for that is I think that, CI Signal does quite a bit of work already in terms of like reading the tea leaves on test grid, and they have to do so within our boards. If we're saying that, what are we saying with adding SIG blocking boards, right? Does that mean that does that mean that the CI Signal team, as well as the SIG, are responsible for watching all of those boards now? Because if that's
One one really quick note that I want to add to that. So in my comment in the issue, I just mentioned blocking and informing just to name it something. But the overall idea and something that I seen that a couple SIGs do is they have jobs. They have, for example, the CLI job that you're mentioning. Those jobs have important information, and they are essentially, what we have in the release blocking jobs. They are jobs that they monitor. They really do fix. So the big idea that I wanted to communicate in the issue is that we just want SIGs to tell us these are the jobs that we absolutely care, that we are absolutely maintaining. Something breaks, we will fix it as soon as possible. And these are other jobs that are a work in progress. We're still figuring out, or they just test something that is not really that important to the rest of the Kubernetes community. So that way we can get a back and forth between the release team, CI Signal, and the owning SIGs of okay, we have these boards in this. Again, I don't know what to call it, but let's say SIG CLI blocking. We have these jobs here, and we would like to propose them to SIG release master informing, master blocking, that type of thing. But the big idea is that I think it will be really useful if we just have some signal of these are the jobs that we absolutely care about and the rest of the community should care about. And these other jobs are work in progress, they need fixing, and we don't have enough people power, etc.
So my thought process is that we already do have that signal. And the signal is the master informing and the master blocking jobs, as well as the master blocking boards, as well as the release blocking and release informing boards, right? If jobs are not on those boards, they're not important, right?
Yes to that, but I guess the big issue is I think CI Signal will be a lot better if we could get more contribution from the SIGs. If SIGs actually reached out to us and hey, we want to promote this to be release blocking.
Right. So this is a process tweak, right? But the canonical place to say that your job is important for a release is our boards. So if they're not on our boards, they're not important.
Yeah, and that makes sense. But at least from the other perspective, let's say that you are the chair of SIG something. For day to day, if you want to triage your issues, your boards, you will be best. It will be easier. It will be easier, better to just go to test grid, SIG, cluster life cycle, look under your test, and then work with the contributors, the members of your SIG, to monitor those tests. And fix it, and essentially just have those changes propagate to release block and release informing.
So that's sugar on top of the test graded configs, right? So what I'm saying is like what SIG release should care about is whether or not it's in our boards, right? If it's not in our boards, then we shouldn't care, right? If a SIG has not proposed it for our boards, right? Then maybe that's a problem. Maybe that's a lack of communication, right? But to add a job to two separate boards is a matter of switching the annotation, right? So they can design from the SIG side, they can design it however they want to. But from our side, what we're saying is we need it to be in our board for us to have visibility on it. Right?
Yeah, definitely. But my big idea is just for the release team. for the SIGs to have to have the same perspective on how to look at their jobs. In terms of adding the jobs, yeah, it's just annotation. There, it's not really a big change that I'm proposing. It's just the idea that we want the same way that the release team looks at the dashboards. We just want to communicate that idea and try to push it forward with the SIGs so that they can look at the dashboards in the same manner that we do.
So I don't want to suggest process for other SIGs, right? I think that it's whatever we do should remove burden from us while not imposing on another SIG, right? I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for if it's something that you want us to care about to put it in our place. Outside of that, I don't want, like, what I'm worried about is like having too much of a heavy hand for other SIGs. We've got, sorry to call out on you, Clayton, but like, Clayton, do you have thoughts on this?
I was not paying attention until about 30 seconds ago, so I didn't catch the full context. But the point you made about reducing your burden without creating unnecessary additional burden is so fundamental to everything we've done that, like, that right there is like, we should get a T-shirt that says that from SIGs, because I think that, like, that's the process goal for most SIGs, like the automation over process.
Yeah, and a really huge +1 for that. But and I guess really the motivation of why I was proposing that workflow is because I don't think that we are essentially telling SIGs what to do. SIGs already have their dashboards. We're just really asking for work with us. Don't just let things run stale in test grid. If you actually look through it more, a lot of the dashboards, they are completely broken, and people some SIGs don't really look at their own test grid dashboards. They just rely on everything that's on SIG Release. So it's just that you already have it. Let's work together. Just communicate back and forth.
So that is leaning into a different issue, right? Which is, if you have a board, you should be looking at your board and maintaining your jobs, right? What we want to prevent is stale, weird, unmaintained jobs from landing on our boards, right? So I think that that's a different issue from whether or not a SIG maintains their own jobs.
But in a way related, again, if you want to add a job, you just add an extra annotation. So if people are maintaining their job, the change just propagates and it just kind of works out for us.
Right. So that doesn't work out for us specifically, because adding that annotation without having a SIG release reviewer on that PR means that something arbitrarily lands on our board.
No, I'm just saying in the case that we already have a job that shows up in SIG release and SIG something. If they are looking at the board, if they're looking at the board, then we can work them issues surface up faster. We have a lot more people working on fixes, and the change is just going to propagate back to us, and we get the good signal faster.
So the issue that you're talking about is not about board configuration. The issue that you're talking about is whether or not people are maintaining and reacting to their jobs. Right?
Yeah.
So as CI signal, yes, you are supposed to make sure that we're good to release based on the tea leaves that you read from Velodrome and Test Grid. However, a lot of those situations have been reactive. You've been reacting to jobs that have not been configured to alert SIGs, right? And that's not fair to your team, right? If a SIG is responsible for their job, they should be responsible for their job. If they're not responsible for it, then it is not important it's not important to the release, right? And should not be on our boards.
Absolutely, and we should add that to the criteria. By the way, if just an FYI, thinking on the 6 CLI job that you mentioned, the reason that it has only released the release team as an alert, that is a mistake that we will fix. What it was actually it was, yeah, that's just a mistake. We'll fix it.
Yeah, I know. I had it on my list to come back and add that alert, but I didn't want to block getting signal on our board by not approving that PR. So
yeah, same thing essentially from our end.
okay, so let's round the wagons. Josh, let's get back to what you were. What you were
Okay,
talking about.
yeah. Well, so I want to see all of that as comments on the issue, please, so that we can get this wrapped up one way or the other. And I noticed nobody had any comments on flakiness criteria.
Oh, geez.
So barring someone else having comments, what's going to happen is that Aaron and I are going to set flakiness criteria, and we're going to PR it in. So
I'm generally fine with that. You and Aaron have experience on the testing and CI signal side. As long as it's something reasonable, I can't read the tea leaves like y'all can. So.
Yeah, I mean, my goal is to tie it to one of the various UIs that Test Infra has, right? Because that's going to be the simplest, right? Must be green on this board, must not show up, in the top 100 flakiest tests, something, because that's going to make it pretty straightforward, and will also give the CI signal team actionable stuff, right? Because when a test job that, say, wasn't on the flaky jobs board shows up on the flaky jobs board, then they just send a link to the owning SIG. I mean, so does automation, but the owning SIG tends not to read the messages from automation.
Yeah. So I think.
Okay.
Yep.
And then the remaining issue is more of a release team documentation issue, so I don't think we actually need a lot of discussion there, which is just one of the things that we put in there is the difference between blocking and informing is that with blocking, at least theoretically, at least someday when we attain our aspirational blocking board, if anything is read on blocking, we don't release. With informing, that's not the case. With informing, CI signal and the release team can make a decision to ignore the failure. And Aaron, I think, pointed out that we need to have some criteria in there by which they make that decision and some process. Particularly, this came up around the SIG scalability stuff, with the idea that for some of those informing tests, if the informing test is actually owned by a SIG, there should probably be a process whereby on a new failure, somebody contacts the SIG and gets their feedback as part of deciding that the failure can be ignored. I think that's a fairly straightforward release team documentation task. Those are the three things outstanding on the whole blocking criteria thing that we know of anyway.
So that's awesome. Thank you, Josh. Thank you for the tremendous amount of work you did to get some of that stuff together, as well as CI signal team. Thank you for tracking this down and providing more context for Josh as he was working through that stuff. So yeah, as Josh said, if you have not commented on those issues and you have opinions, please voice them before they turn down those issues. All right. Next topic is Hannes.
Hannes just dropped.
Okay, so let me provide some context here. So the next topic is what would we need to be true for us to remove the blockade on K release, right? So I created a blockade on K release, which basically anything that is potentially a release thingy stuff, which is most of the stuff in the repo, honestly. So if it touches a release tool like Anago, branch fast forward, the GCB manager, anything that is in the GCV directory for stage or release, anything that might be in the way we configure our images or the build directory, really it's a good portion of K-release gets tagged, gets blockaded, right? So it marks, so for people who aren't familiar with what the blockade is, it's a Prow plugin that allows you to configure a regex to essentially block PRs from merging if they touch a directory or file that matches that regex, right? So this came up because we did some stuff. We did quite a bit of stuff. We were working through some shell check updates, trying to clean up the repo, and this led to several bad things happening, which basically took down Kubernetes for a bit. So I think one of the major things that we touched was the push build script, which is in the top level directory, and so if push build doesn't work, it can't push. Essentially, push build is a script that Kubernetes calls. There is a periodic job that runs, or 2 periodic jobs, maybe 3. No, it's down to 2, right? So CI Kubernetes build and CI Kubernetes build fast. Those 2 jobs basically push staging versions of Kubernetes up to GCS buckets, right? So those staging versions of Kubernetes, when those jobs happen, they also push version marker files, right? So if you're familiar with any of the CI signal and you've seen a script that has something like CI/latest.txt in it, or Kate's master, or Kate's beta, or Kate's stable 1, 2, 3 .txt. Those are the version marker files that get used, that get pushed up to the GCS bucket, right? Those files are essentially used in so many places across test infra that when that job breaks, or if those files don't get pushed correctly, or if something was wrong with that job and the version marker file got pushed anyway, it will take down all of those jobs. So that's essentially what happened. That happened around the 1.12.10 timeframe. I think right as 1.12 was going out of support was when we decided to do this. So the issue that I linked in the notes, and I have to come back and add some more details to this since we've done some more investigation since then, but the issue that is linked there essentially is a walkthrough of a lot of the things that happened. Bad things, good things, stuff that we discovered, including if you ever wanted to know like how these jobs are built or run, there's an explanation here, which probably should turn into test infra documentation. So one of the big things I wanted to do in that state was prevent that from happening again while we were trying to understand the way this stuff works. So that's what the blockade was for. Right, so the blockade is basically saying only people with, this is a blockade that cannot be overridden. So if you're not familiar with the overrides, override is a plugin in Prow as well that allows you to essentially cancel required contexts for PRs. Right, so that's, say a job is failing and you don't care if the job is failing. If you're a repo admin and override is configured on your repo, you can /override the name of the test. Don't do this if you don't do this. So this is something that cannot be controlled via override. It is something that can only be controlled if you have access to, if you're a repo admin essentially, and you can change labels on a repo. Right. So by removing the do not merge blocked paths label, that will essentially pull the blockade, and you'll be allowed to merge PRs. So essentially what I was saying is I want SIG chairs to review all of the PRs going into something that will potentially break Kubernetes, right? So that blockade is still on. Hannes is asking, what does it take for us to remove that blockade, right? And the answer is, so I said a few things, right? I wanted to add a blockade. I wanted to examine and document exactly why the release blocking jobs are failing. So we figured that out. Tagging the repo after executing a successful release of Kubernetes. The reason for this was that we wanted to lock in a known good state of the Kubernetes release repo, right? So that way, if we were trying out changes, like essentially if we can't make safe changes if we can't iterate over this repo, we're not improving, right? And this is a repo that has classically been not touched. So I want to move to a place where we are touching it, and I think we are in that place. So what I was thinking is, in order for us to feel comfortable in making safe changes or new changes to the repo, if we had the jobs that we're targeting the repo, so essentially there are a bunch of jobs that will check out 2 repos, Kubernetes as well as Kubernetes release within test infra. If we have those jobs targeted to a tag of Kubernetes release, that means, like, if we find a good tag, we can configure jobs to use that tag, and then we can move forward on master. I think we have different ideas now, in that we would instead tie the essentially tie the lifecycle of, or partially tie the lifecycle of Kubernetes release to Kubernetes, right? So creating release branches for Kubernetes release, wiring them into the scripts that we already have. So when you do something like configure, do config forker stuff within test infra, or do a branch fast forward, say, for example, maybe it does it for both repos, right? So that way we stay in sync across the release cycle, and we cut releases for, but this is a larger discussion, and it's not something I want to try to wedge into this meeting, because I have ideas and they're not all written down yet, and I want everyone to have appropriate context before we move into that. So maybe for the Monday SIG release meeting, we can chat about what to do with tagging and branching. I think that would be a good plan. There are also interesting conversations on Twitter that I would like to bring forth regarding stability releases. Could be an interesting conversation. I think comes up basically comes up every year. So short version, I think that we are in a much safer place and we can remove that blockade, as I think we understand the repo a lot better than we did at the time that we did what we did, or understand all of the intermingled pieces. So I will do that. I will remove the blockade and close that out. Yep.
When you say that repo, do you mean a folder in Kubernetes?
No, Kubernetes release.
Okay, thank you.
That's where all the release engineering, well, most of the release engineering tools live for cutting Kubernetes.
Yeah.
All right, questions, comments, concerns on that? Cool. All right, so moving on to the working group LTS. Working group LTS has quite a bit of stuff here. They've got a draft KEP rolling. I believe we had Dewal. Tim,
I'm here.
Do you want?
Yeah. Sorry, I joined a little late. I was on the working group Kate's infra call and lost track of time. So, summary briefly. About a year ago-ish, there started being discussion of a possible working group to look at our overall support stance on the project, the life cycle, release cadence, all of those sort of things. Working groups are time limited. We were aiming to try to get together a set of proposals by this fall, and that's kind of happening. There's a draft KEP underway. The main thing that's in discussion right now is to extend the support lifecycle by 1 release. So currently we support 3 releases going backwards, or about 9 months. So specifically what that would mean, like right now, is 1.13 is 12 days away from going out of support. And just to do a quick screen share, just because I think data is useful on this. This is a copy of the CNCF spreadsheets because I wanted to like chop out some stuff and just focus on a bit of information, colorize it a bit. So the CNCF keeps a list of who's submitted conformance results on which versions, and just looking at our supported versions in hosted platforms, so somebody that's got a staff, they're taking our Kubernetes releases and running them as a service on behalf of others. There's, looking at the bigger named ones here, there's some notable ones who are still only on 1.13, and it's 12 days from going out of support. What we've also heard through doing a survey of the community, and we got close to 500 respondents, I think, between operators, developers, users of Kubernetes, is that folks are used to an enterprise sort of annual release cadence or some sort of longer life cycle than this 9 months that we give. And 9 months practically becomes a fair amount less because you have some period where you're trialing the new thing after it's been released, you get shift over and get into production. And that amount of movement may consume a lot of the 9-month support that we give. Having an annual release would make things easier for people. The other aspect of this today is that 1.13 won't quite really maybe go out of support in only 12 days. In the past, we've been fuzzy. There's been some period during which we haven't quite spun down CI yet. We don't do it instantly on the day of the next release. And part of this KEP proposal is to formalize that and say that there will be a 2-month period where instead of 9 months of general critical bug fix, we'd have an additional 2-month window, and probably during that period, it would only be CVE fixes if they happen to come out in that period, so that there's this little window of time during which still you could move. So that's kind of the high level of what's in the KEP. 12-month or 4 releases support plus this little 2-month formalization that we roughly already kind of have now is a 1-month-ish period.
So I think I'd mentioned on the last meeting that this was brought up, that what about 15 months and just like an even 15 months, right? That way, even, quote unquote, even, right? That way it hits a release boundary again, right? And we can say it's cut at that very time, right? Instead of having like an arbitrary time that's kind of in between release cycles to do this. Right.
The numbers are all arbitrary at this point, and the reason this is a KEP and the reason we're discussing it now is to draw in broader feedback on the specifics of the numbers.
So I think that I think that this is stuff that y'all have probably already thought of, but the things that come to mind is additional burden. Is this going to cause additional burden for release teams, for patch release managers? Yes-ish, right? For the patch release team, it's not too bad. Like I think like cutting a patch release is not crazy painful, especially if we decide. I
want to so we have a couple of things where we wanted to try and get feedback on sizing or cost, and the first one there is staffing impact for an additional release branch. So I think there's 2 aspects of that I see operating on the patch release team. The first is just processing of patches and getting the cherry picks into the branches, monitoring the CI to make sure we didn't destabilize things. At this point, the vast majority of cherry picks going onto release branches go onto all branches. And I believe also, like if we were doing this right now, there wouldn't be much of a change. Right now, we look at a sort of cherry pick from a meta perspective and it lands on the 3 branches. The work to review it and do that for 4 versus 3 isn't much. Then, so that's the processing the incoming stuff onto the branch. The output of the patch release team is another potential cost, building. The building perspective in terms of the binaries, I don't see this being much cost. Again, it's fairly straightforward. We kick some stuff off in GCB in the cloud, it happens. The bigger concern that I have is around packaging right now, since we depend on a Googler for that portion. I know we're working to get away from that. That I think could be a bit more of a bottleneck. That's the long pull today. So adding a 4th makes that an even longer pull.
So let's, so I think that moving into 117, this is for Tim, Caleb, anyone who is here that is a part of the release managers group, release engineering overall, So that's patch release team, the release engineer, the branch management, build admins, SIG chairs. We need to make packaging a focus for 117, right? And I think it's been said and it's been in our heads and we've had DMs about it, but it needs to be a focus for 117. I think that what we have in place right now, in terms of GCP projects, we now have a staging test project and a Kate's release test prod project for GCP. So we have like the playgrounds that we need to vet this stuff. We need to focus on repo design for both apt and yum. We need to focus on a tool that allows us to easily do that. I recently added some updates to the Docker files that do the RPM and deb builds. So now you can, and the deb builder, since it was already a Go tool, is now a module. So you could do a go get deb builder, and you would have the things that you need to create debs. So we should focus on getting that stuff done so that we can vet out what it looks like to have a repo that is not behind the Google curtain, so to speak. Right? There are also discussions about like how do we sign it, right? And the Google the GCP HSM seems like a reasonable path forward. We just need to poke at it.
So on that front, I think we're on a reasonable path to managing that incremental cost and actually making most of it go away. And this is a draft KEF where the hope would be to discuss it, socialize it with SIGs, get the details ironed out, get it towards maybe final discussion at KubeCon in November and hopefully into an implementable state. And then there would be those details. But I think from a SIG release perspective, our hope would be by the new year that we have a lot of this stuff sorted out. And I think that's kind of the trajectory of the KEP, so those could line up.
Yeah, I would hope to see that we have the KEP really close to an implementable state before KubeCon. That way, as we're talking about, I know it's later on the agenda, but as we're talking about the contributor summit sessions, which we have ideas for but haven't submitted proposals yet for.
Due Friday.
Yes.
The Working Group LTS has submitted a proposal for Contrib Summit specifically to discuss this KEP.
Right, so this needs to be a release engineering contributor summit session where we essentially just have a war room, right? I think we haven't had the time to sit down and really go through the board.
Well, from the Working Group LTS perspective, actually the release portion of stuff, like that's what you're focused on at the moment, but the release portion is one of the smaller parts of the concern. The working group is also focused heavily on looking at what APIs need to get to what stability level and when the code base is actually ready to be more supportable in a longer duration way, because there's also implications here on how users upgrade and how they manage to migrate between versions of Kubernetes with data that's behind the scenes at different levels and needs mutated across those upgrades and things. So there's a lot more there that they're worried about.
Oh yeah, this is this is also a change in our general policy about releases and about the tools that we use, the different API components. But that is a policy change, right? That is a policy change that partially happens on the architecture side, partially happens on the release side, and is not totally an LTS. Like ultimately, it's not totally an LTS concern.
Sure. The working group just puts forward a proposal, but the set of stakeholders for the KEP is very large.
Right.
It's not just release engineering.
But I think that is a component supportability concern, and not like, yes, there's a separate upgrade concern, but we're not just talking about upgrades. We're talking about the support of a specific version, right? And yeah, I think that like whether I can skip versions or whether I can or whether like there will be compatibility between n and -2 and -3 and -x versions, and whether or not the version is supported are two different concerns, right? So I want to make sure that we don't conflate those two. And I know that y'all have already talked about
deliberately separated those out. So we're starting to get short on time, and there's a couple other topics to briefly I want to make y'all aware of and try and get a little bit of feedback on. The next one is around keeping CI running longer. That's going to come at a cost. I've never heard specifically from Google, and the hope had been, I think, when this working group had started, that the working group Kate's infra would be further along to have more moved over to where it's actively tracked and managed through the community. But it's unclear what the actual dollars cost would be in running the additional CI. But that's something for us to be aware of and probably or to try to suss out, and we'll need to get more of that from SIG testing. But I wanted to see here too, because I know in various conversations in SIG release, people have said like it's no big deal to keep it running. That's part of why we have kept it running instead of cutting it off immediately when we hit that 9-month period. But I don't know if anybody here has more detail.
Numbers, yeah. So I know that we generate billing reports for Kate's infra, at least, right? Do we do the same for the Google stuff, or is that just kind of managed somewhere in space?
I've never seen it for the existing stuff.
Okay, so I think the only way we're going to get an answer on this is if people are willing to give us numbers, or if we're able to mock out some of this on CNCF infra. You're muted.
Yeah. One is right now when we turn that CI down, it's kind of just in the bullet list of things that the new release team does. I don't know. I feel like I've been meaning to go look for it, but I thought we had some changes recently to kind of formalize that a little bit more and make it a specific week of the release team's activities. But are folks open to that being decoupled from the release team? Like this, it feels like
it is decoupled from the release team.
Okay, that has now. Okay.
Yes, so that was part of the test infra tasks that were turned down during 1.15, end of 1.15. That is now part of the branch management role within the release managers group.
Okay. Right. And any concerns then, since you were the one making that sort of change, do you see any reason, like it's an arbitrary date today, effectively making it a different arbitrary date for reasons?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be potentially any date. When it's happening right now is essentially when we cut beta. Right, so when beta gets cut, the new branch gets generated, all of the jobs get flipped over, including the old ones getting turned down.
Okay, so that sounds straightforward then.
Yeah, super straightforward.
Change the date in the doc.
Also, those docs will be more generalized. Right now, it kind of reads as a branch management handbook, and what I want it to be is like, this is what we look like when we change branches, right? So anyone can come read it and maybe put that in a more visible place.
Okay, and then the final section that we're thinking about in the working group is around third-party dependencies. So, well, actually, back up. There's one more bullet there before that. Defining what is the input into the patch releases. This is, I feel like, is on me to do a better job of, as we've been working things through the patch release team, going from individuals to a team. We've built up a little bit of a shared knowledge of what we think is the criteria, but the working group would be proposing something even more strict than that, that we get more strict on criticality of fixes going into the patch releases, where it's been somewhat fuzzy deliberately today, and then in that beyond the 1-year window, in that final 2-month period, that we're saying that we would only accept CVEs when proposed by the security team.
I think that that's fair. I would say CVs and whatever our definition of critical bug fix is, right, is fair for that window. What I've seen from seeing some of the patch release announcements or discussions is that what we could probably use is a finer tuned definition of what it looks like for a how we essentially grade fixes for vertical SIGs, right? So maybe even more specifically, like cloud providers, right? I think a lot of things have come up where the differentiation between what is a bug fix to a cloud provider, what is something that should have landed in the initial code. I think that it's fair to call something a bug fix if the code did not include some implementation detail that should have been considered, right?
I think that that's going to become less of an issue anyway. The trajectory of this kept landing kind of next year, and us shifting to a different time scale is also corresponding with the entry cloud provider deprecation. So as we free up the cloud providers to run on their own cadence, we don't have that much of a problem there anymore either, hopefully.
True. So I know that, we have, there's a plan for 118-ish for that stuff, the entry cloud provider removal, but I'm not gonna jinx it, but I would say let's make a plan to assume, let's make a plan assuming that date doesn't get hit, right? Just for the sake of
pragmatically, this stuff is marching roughly in the same direction going forward. The last big bucket of stuff is around third-party dependencies, and from a SIG release perspective, just the last couple of days we've been talking about the new Golang release, but there's always a new Golang release, whether it's one for a CVE or it's a patch release or the twice yearly majors. But we also have other third-party dependencies beyond just Golang. So we have this problem today where this stuff is not managed super tightly. Our dependencies life cycles don't line up with our life cycle. Golang already is one where we typically once or twice a year for a few weeks or a month or maybe two, we're using a version that's outside of their support. And that's only going to get worse if Kubernetes were to elongate its support lifecycle. So I think it drives us to figuring out how to better formalize how we manage patch releases coming in and shifts to new major releases on any of those dependencies. But the Golang is an easy example for thinking about the specifics of how that plays out. And it's a problem today that we need to solve regardless of this KEP, but the KEP would push us towards getting better at it.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've recently worked on is the build dependencies.yaml, right? So that moves us into a place where we better understand version bumps for external dependencies. It doesn't get us all the way there. I think that in terms of things like Golang, we also need to understand who all touches these dependency bumps, right? Because essentially there's a team of people who are aware that Go has been bumped, and like Liggett is part of that, and Christoph and Ben and a bunch of others who Dims and like a bunch of others who kind of come out of the woodwork.
And we're working just to formalize how we manage our own stuff in K-release. All the talk earlier about blockade, and we have no corollary for all of these other couple dozen dependencies, whether it's etcd or Golang or a whole bunch of others. This is a big area of complexity where our risk management is quite weak as we increment the versions under use. Like some of them hardly even get test exposure consistently or formally until we've committed the change.
I know, like personally, the CRI and the CNI stuff that I try to bump, it's just like it gets held there because I don't think we understand the entirety of the problem or what needs to be fixed, who needs to push an image at what date, and this test won't work until someone pushes the image over here. Like we need to understand the stakeholders, the process for each of those releases. If it's something that we own, like we don't own CNI anymore. Right, we kind of do, but we kind of don't. It's no longer Kubernetes, right? CRI is a bit of a different story. The CRI tools, they live within Kubernetes SIGs, right? So that's something that we technically all have ownership of as a project. But there's a bunch of other stuff where, like etcd, we have close partnership with the people who work on etcd. They're also contributors in Kubernetes, but they have their own release cycles. So we need to identify the stakeholders. We need to enumerate all of the external dependencies as much as we can. We need to have a process that literally anyone can do to bump these things, to vet these things, right? And that will involve bringing all of those stakeholders in to describe what their release process is, to describe the things that we need to look at. One of the issues that was open about keeping, well, it's been open for a while, but keeping Golang up to date, or making sure it's up to date across all of the release branches. Just earlier today or yesterday or something, I found out that there's a 113 performance regression in Go. And that's a performance regression that has been open for 2 months that we, as the release team and SIG release overall, didn't necessarily know about, right? So how do we also control the flow of information about things like that? That's something that SIG scalability was aware of, but we weren't. So we had a discussion about it yesterday, and it shouldn't have been yesterday. It should have been much earlier. But
we need to, like, the standard CI/CD flow, if you're doing something simpler and you have Travis, is you have multiple streams set up where you're testing the Golangs you care about and Golang head.
Yep. So they apparently
there's a link to the KEP there. Any of y'all, I would love it if folks could give it a read through, throw some comments in it. It's gone a bit past early draft. We're looking to get a little more concrete feedback and get it finalized, and then hopefully be getting any final polishing done at KubeCon face to face.
Do we have a date? I know we're at time, everyone. Sorry. Do we have a date for that LTS? Like, I think if we said, okay, the LTS proposal will be done at this date, I think it would encourage more people to make sure they have their feedback in before then.
We're going to go around to each of the primary SIG stakeholder groups. So, like, this is kind of the first one with SIG release, and talk to them, get their feedback, and see how off we are, and based on that, refine it a bit. And I think at that point, declare a date that we want to have final feedback ahead of KubeCon.
Okay, sounds good.
This has been it's a very controversial topic. Let's put it that way. So we don't want to declare an arbitrarily near date before we've gotten a little more people, because people don't read the KEP until you push them to, or you declare the date. But then they're like, why did you? This is totally wrong. You can't be done by now.
Yeah,
so
I mean the biggest part is the biggest part is I don't want it in the KEP graveyard. Like, I want it to get out, be clear, and like, let's land it, and then
working groups are time limited, and we expect to wrap up this fall, or either have a mandate to continue on something specific into the next year.
Got it. Cool. So we have a few additional agenda topics. They're primarily talking about the SIG release, the KubeCon events. So the SIG release intro, deep dive, and contributor summit. Contributor summit, we still need to talk about the intros. The intro will be a walkthrough of release team activities and shadow mentoring and so on and so forth, held by Gwyn and Lockie. And the deep dive will be myself and Hannes on release engineering. So the contributor summit stuff is TBD. I think that what we can do is maybe shoot something out to the mailing list, Tim, and we won't have time to do that before the date. All right, so yeah, something to the mailing list, and we can discuss there and discuss on the channel and try to get something together.
And I think I put that date there, Sept 9, but I could swear the deadline was Friday, actually, which would be the 6th. Either way, this is on us close.
Yeah, so I thought the deadline for the Kubernetes forum in Seoul and Sydney was the 6th, and this deadline might be the 11th. Anyway, we should verify it and finish it. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This was a lot of fun. I think we talked about some really important issues, important process improvements to move forward. So not same bat time, same bat channel, but next week we'll have the SIG release meeting now at its new time on Mondays. So the event should already be in your calendar. Everything should be up to date. Thank you for attending this special edition. Later.